When we talk about the 20th century, we can see that the musical landscape becomes very diverse. If we were to consider music as a language with composers in the 18th century speaking classical music and in the 19th century speaking romantic music, then the 20th century becomes almost a Tower of Babel with many different languages being spoken. The nearly 300-year-old tradition of tonal music was giving way to music that was not only dissonant, but completely without a tonal center, that is, atonal. Pieces of music in the key of C or D or any other key were being elbowed aside by the new language of atonality. All the composers on this slide contributed to the gradual but decisive move to new harmonic landscapes, loosed from their tonal moorings in favor of music that had a much higher level of dissonance. At the same time, audiences had to adjust to music that most found harder to understand and were sometimes even considered ugly, harsh, or just plain noisy. There was restlessness among composers to find new well springs of inspiration, centered on sound itself, rather than on traditional harmonic landscapes. If you look here at this slide, you can see Igor Stravinsky, the composer of Le Sacre du Printemps, or The Rite of Spring, which caused a riot at its Paris premiere because of its crazy-looking dancing and also because of the harshness and primitiveness of the music. Here in the center we see Claude Debussy, who was more of a sensualist, someone who said to his teachers, "I don't have to follow the rules, all I have to follow is my own pleasure." Over here on the right we see Alexander Scriabin, who could have been the real pioneer of the 20th century had it not been for Igor Stravinsky. Scriabin was somewhat of a, well, not somewhat, he was a very eccentric man at the end of his life, thinking that he was actually going to create a musical community in the Himalayan mountains with a temple for the worship of music. He was a real weirdo. He was into all kinds of things, including, seances and soul travel and all that stuff. But he also had a music that was incredibly intense and incredibly ahead of its time. Down here we have Arnold Schoenberg, who was the composer who was kind of like the Moses figure of the 20th century. He was the one that took all of this atonality and tried to make it into something that was coherent, with a system that he called composing with 12 tones, music composed with 12 tones, which is the number of semitones in the octave on a piano or any other instrument. In the center here we see our first great American composer, a real experimentalist, Charles Ives, the son of a Union band conductor, who had figured out early in his life that what he wanted to do was to be able to write the real American experience in all of its messiness and all of its pushed together musics. So he wrote music where all kinds of stuff was happening all at the same time, almost like a collage. It was music that was meant to be heard in its totality rather than picked apart into its separate pieces. Ives is an incredibly important person in the experimental tradition. Over here we have Bela Bartok, the great Hungarian musician and pianist and composer, who spent the early part of the 20th century going into the backwoods of Hungary, in places that people hadn't been for 1,000 years, going into remote villages and finding people who were singing songs that no one had ever heard. He recorded them all on a primitive recording device, and then he came back to Budapest, the capital of Hungary, and he transcribed it and used it as the source of his music. There was also a greater Russian presence in Eastern European cultures. You see over here we've got Vienna, which is one of the traditional centers of culture, and down here we have Paris, another traditional center of culture right around the 20th century. But over here we've got Budapest. Look at that, we got an onion dome type of thing there, a little bit more Eastern looking. Over here we've got St. Petersburg, also with the onion dome type of look there as I'm circling around it. These are more Eastern Oriental type of cities with Eastern and Oriental type of cultures. And with them came the influence of folk music and folk and mythical stories and traditions. Well, also, there was New York. New York, New York. New York surged to the forefront as an important music capital, beginning with the founding of symphony orchestras in the later 19th century. As the 20th century dawned, the whole world looked towards America to see what would truly be the American music, the authentic mouthpiece of American culture. America was then, probably even more than today, a melting pot A strong ingredient in the American sound was jazz, and the composer who embodied that most was George Gershwin. It's your bottom left. Jazz and near jazz would become a recognizable trait of what the world came to regard as truly American music. You can see also here the famous Cotton Club, which was where white America actually came, especially New York, urban white America, came to learn what it was like to interact with African American culture. Because this was the club where white American and white New Yorkers could come and listen to African American music, such as this band over here with the great Louis Armstrong in the middle. If New Orleans was the place that jazz was born, well, I would say that New York was definitely the place that jazz came of age, especially in the 1920s. You know, American composers have always had a complicated relationship with European musical culture. They sometimes follow its example and they sometimes reject it. The composers on this slide represent different sides of either an experimental tradition or a more traditional European-centric approach. They also represent a new attempt at creating a common language out of that Tower of Babel I mentioned before. The godfather of both the experimental and the traditional was this man right here, the Austrian Anton von Webern, a great, great composer, a composer who influenced generations of composers, who was tragically shot dead before his time, accidentally after World War II when he happened to be out on the street after curfew. Right here we have Milton Babbitt, who is the person who took Schoenberg's ideas and really made them come to a fine mathematical point. He also got very interested in computers and synthesizer music. This is a synthesizer behind him. Over here we have the great French composer Pierre Boulez and the French composer Olivier Messiaen, both really great and important composers of the 20th century. Right over here we have Elliott Carter, who is one of the American composers who really kind of defied tradition but went his own way and lived to the ripe old age of 100, writing music that's still being played today. Here we have Henry Cowell, who in the early part of the 20th century did things like play with his elbows and with his fists and inside the piano and putting objects inside the piano in order to create new sonorities, strumming the strings of the piano and then coming up with pieces with exotic titles like The Tides of Menuhin and Tiger. Over here we've got John Cage, the composer who was very, very interested in Eastern traditions, specifically the teachings of D.T. Suzuki, the great Zen master. And Cage got interested in doing things like placing objects between the strings of the piano and turning it into a strange kind of percussion orchestra that kind of made it sound almost like it was a gamelan of Indonesia. Down here we've got two Italian composers, Luigi Dalla Piccola right here, and then Luciano Berio right here, two great Italian composers of the 20th century, wrote some fascinating music. Okay, so the result is an incredible density and complexity of music, stretching the limits of performers' abilities and oftentimes the patience of the paying concert-going public. Well, now we come to this slide here. Then came the 1960s. By the 1960s, composers began to feel that the music they could write could again be tonal. It could be in the key of C, it could be in the key of D, but with a fresh new face, so to speak. Composers such as Lamont Young, Terry Riley, Philip Glass, and Steve Reich became very interested in a music that unfolded at a slower pace, where chords would be continued over and over and over again, and they would be experienced in a very different way, that the time continuum of music would be changed towards longer and longer phrases. Right here we have Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, who was a contemporary of Pierre Boulez from the earlier slide. He's showing here one of his electronic music scores, where he's showing what's going on here. And here we have Pauline Oliveras. She's a composer who likes to get the audience involved in what's going on. She brings them into the performance so that it becomes a new piece of music every time it's played. And up here we have Joan Tower, the Pulitzer Prize-winning composer who was an American but grew up along the banks of the Amazon and wrote a piece called Amazon, which is a finely crafted piece of music. Absolutely wonderful. So anyway, this is your little introduction to 20th century music from the beginning through the 1960s. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope if you have any questions, you will feel free to let me know what your questions are. Thanks for watching.